I never told my daughter what I really kept inside Warehouse 42. When she married a slick, fast-talking gold digger who thought he could outsmart a retired old man, I made sure he would never find the key. But while I was sitting comfortably at home, nursing a glass of bourbon, my warehouse manager called me in a dead panic. "Sir, your son-in-law is here. He has bolt cutters, and he brought 2 armed men." I did not panic. I had been waiting for this exact moment, and what I did next brought his entire fake world crashing down. If you are connecting with my story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my upcoming life stories. Tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me really happy to know which corner of the country or the world is listening to me and what time of day it is for you. It was exactly 11:30 at night. The rain was coming down hard, beating violently against the thick glass windows of my home in the Pittsburgh suburbs. I am Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old and I spent my entire life building an industrial salvage empire from rust, sweat, and scrap metal. People look at me now and see a quiet, retired widower. They see a man who tends to his garden and drinks his evening bourbon in peace. They do not see the man who survived 30 years in the cutthroat steel and salvage industry. I had just poured myself a generous measure of that bourbon, the good stuff I saved for special occasions, when my burner phone buzzed. It vibrated heavily against the mahogany desk. Very few people have that number. One of them is Hector Morales, a 65-year-old military veteran who has managed my properties with absolute loyalty for 2 decades. I picked it up. Hector did not bother with greetings. His voice was a harsh, raspy whisper, barely rising above the sound of the torrential rain on his end. "Mr. Caldwell, it is happening. Derek is at gate 4. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, feeling the familiar burn of the alcohol slide down my throat. "Is he alone, Hector?" "No, sir," Hector replied, his breath hitching slightly. "He has bolt cutters and he brought company. 2 large men. They are armed. I can see the glint of handguns tucked into their waistbands." "What are your orders? Do I engage? Do I trigger the silent alarms?" I stood up from my leather chair and walked over to my desk. I picked up my iPad, my fingers tapping the screen to bring up the hidden high-definition surveillance feed I had secretly installed weeks ago. The screen flickered to life, cutting through the darkness with crisp night vision. There he was, my son-in-law, Derek Thorne, the self-proclaimed venture capitalist, the man who wore suits that cost more than my first car, standing in the freezing mud of an industrial district, gripping a pair of heavy iron bolt cutters. I watched the rain plaster his perfectly styled hair to his forehead. I saw the desperate, greedy twitch in his jaw. "No, Hector," I said, my voice dead calm. "Do not engage. Do not call the police. I want you to pull all the perimeter guards back. Open the outer blind spots. Give him a clear path to the main loading dock." Hector hesitated for only a fraction of a second. He knew me too well to question my sanity. "Are you absolutely sure, sir? Those men with him look like serious trouble." "I am entirely sure," I replied, resting my hand on a framed photograph of my late wife, Patty. "Let him cut the lock, Hector. Let him walk right in. Tonight, he digs his own grave, and I want to watch him jump inside." I hung up the phone and set it down. On the screen, Derek was struggling with the heavy chain securing the outer chain link fence. He looked pathetic, a rat trying to gnaw its way into a steel trap. He had no idea what was waiting for him from inside that rusted, dilapidated warehouse. He thought he was about to secure his financial freedom. He thought he had outsmarted a clueless old boomer. As I watched him finally snap the first lock, a cold, hard knot of anger tightened in my chest. To understand how we ended up here with my daughter's husband committing a major felony in the dead of night, you have to go back exactly 3 months. You have to go back to the exact moment the seed of doubt was planted. The moment I realized a parasite had attached itself to my family. It was Brooke and Derek's 2nd wedding anniversary. Brooke is my 32-year-old daughter. She is the light of my life, a sweet, trusting soul who runs her own boutique floral design shop. When Patty passed away, I made a silent vow at her graveside that I would protect our daughter from everything, from heartbreak, from failure, and most importantly, from greedy men who prey on kindness. Brooke had organized a celebratory dinner at a high-end steakhouse downtown. I arrived early, wearing a simple but clean suit, happy just to see my daughter smile. Derek arrived 15 minutes late, loudly complaining to the valet, flashing his expensive watch, and acting like he owned the entire restaurant. He always rubbed me the wrong way. He talked too fast, promised too much, and always seemed to be looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important had walked into the room. We were halfway through our rye-buys when the conversation took a very strange turn. Brooke was talking about a new flour supplier she had found, but Derek was completely distracted. He kept tapping his fork against his water glass, his eyes darting toward me. "So, Harrison," Derek said casually, leaning back in his chair and swirling his wine. "I was driving through the industrial park the other day, looking at some commercial real estate for a tech startup I am funding. I happened to pass by one of your old properties. Warehouse 42, I think it is called. I stopped chewing. I placed my fork down very slowly. I did not react outwardly, but internally every single alarm bell I possessed began to ring. I have never discussed my business assets with Derek. I have never mentioned Warehouse 42 to anyone, not even to Brooke. It was an old, rusted facility sitting on a neglected patch of land. There was absolutely no reason for a venture capitalist to be driving through that specific rundown area, let alone pulling property records to know it belonged to me. Is that so?" I asked, maintaining a perfectly neutral, slightly confused expression. "Just an old holding property, nothing but dust and rusted pipes." "Why do you ask?" Derek smiled. It was a slick practice smile that did not reach his eyes. "Just curious. It seems like prime real estate if you clear the junk out. A massive footprint. You know, holding on to dead weight like that is bad business, Harrison. Taxes, liabilities. Have you ever thought about liquidating it? I have some developers who would pay top dollar just for the land." I looked at my daughter. Brooke was blissfully unaware of the tension, sipping her champagne and smiling at her husband. She thought he was just being helpful. She thought he was the successful, wealthy investor he claimed to be. But my gut, the instinct honed by decades of dealing with scrap metal thieves, corrupt contractors, and greedy businessmen, told me otherwise. Why would a man who supposedly manages tens of millions in venture capital care about an abandoned warehouse in the Rust Belt? Why was he digging into my private holdings? And why, despite his expensive suits, did his eyes look so desperately hungry? I picked up my napkin and wiped my mouth. I let a slow, harmless, grandfatherly smile spread across my face. The kind of smile that makes a predator think his prey is completely blind. "Well, Derek," I said, keeping my voice light and slightly raspy, "I am just a retired old man. Real estate markets and developer portfolios are a bit over my head these days. I just let it sit there. It is not hurting anyone." I saw a brief, sharp flash of satisfaction in Derek's eyes. He thought I was weak. He thought I was ignorant. He thought he had just found a gold mine guarded by a senile old fool. But as I sat there in the restaurant matching his fake smile with my own, I knew one thing for certain. My daughter was married to a fraud. I did not know what his angle was yet or how deep his lies went. But I was going to find out. I was going to tear his entire facade apart piece by piece until the ugly truth was exposed for Brooke to see. I paid the bill that night without batting an eye. When the waiter brought the leather folder, Derek did not even make the polite customary gesture of reaching for his wallet. He simply leaned back, patted his stomach, and praised the quality of the Wagyu beef. I handed over my credit card with a warm smile, playing the role of the generous, satisfied father perfectly. But beneath the table, my hands were clenched into tight fists. My knuckles, permanently scarred from decades of pulling jagged steel apart, throbbed with a dull ache. The ride home was quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets of Pittsburgh slick and reflective under the amber glow of the streetlights. Driving my old reliable truck through the city, my mind drifted back to the early days. It is funny how people like Derek look at me now. They see an old man in a flannel shirt and assume my life was as simple as my wardrobe. They have no idea what it took to build a salvage empire from absolute zero. When Patty and I first married, we had nothing but a rusted pickup truck and a mountain of debt. I spent 14 hours a day in the salvage yards. I breathed in the smell of burning copper diesel fuel and damp earth until it seeped into my very pores. I tore apart condemned factories, stripped copper wiring from abandoned mills, and hauled scrap iron until my back felt like it was breaking in two. I did it all for them. Patty would come down to the yard at 7 in the evening, carrying a thermos of black coffee and 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil. We would sit on the tailgate of that old truck covered in grime and talk about the future we were building for Brooke. I promised Patty on her deathbed that I would never let anyone take what we had built for our little girl. I intended to keep that promise. Men like Derek Thorne despise the dirt. They recoil at the smell of sweat and grease. Yet they are the first to show up with their manicured hands, extended desperate to claim the money that the dirt produced. He thought I was just an old fool, hoarding useless industrial lots. He did not realize that in my line of work, you learn how to spot a piece of worthless scrap disguised as something shiny. I barely slept that night. I sat in my study, the only room in my house that still smells faintly of the old salvage days, and stared at the dark oak walls. Why did he ask about that specific warehouse? The holding company that owns it is buried under layers of legal protection. Someone would have to be actively hunting for my assets to trace that property back to me. The answer came knocking on my front door the very next morning at exactly 9 lie. I was in the kitchen brewing a pot of dark roast coffee when the doorbell chimed. When I opened the door, I found Derek standing on the porch. He was wearing a sharp tailored navy suit, holding an expensive leather briefcase. Brooke was standing right beside him, holding his arm, looking up at him with a gaze so full of blind admiration it made my stomach turn. "Good morning, Harrison," Derek said, flashing that identical bright empty smile from the restaurant. "I hope we are not interrupting your morning routine." I wiped my hands on a dish towel and ushered them inside. "Not at all," I said, keeping my voice gentle and welcoming. "I was just making coffee. What brings you two out so early on a Saturday?" Brooke kissed my cheek. "Derek was up half the night working, Dad," she said, her voice brimming with pride. "He wanted to show you something important." I led them into the living room and offered them a seat. Derek unzipped his briefcase with practice efficiency. He pulled out a thick, glossy financial portfolio bound in a professional folder and slid it across the coffee table toward me. It looked like the kind of presentation you give to a board of directors, not your retired father-in-law on a Saturday morning. "Harrison, I know we briefly touched on this last night." Derek began leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees to appear earnest and sincere. "But I could not stop thinking about your portfolio. I did some deep diving into the county property records. I hope you do not mind. I just want to look out for the family." I picked up the folder. The first page showed an aerial map of the industrial district with my property outlined in bright red ink. Next to it was a breakdown of estimated property taxes and maintenance liabilities. "You are bleeding money on a dead asset, Harrison." Derek continued his voice, dropping into a tone of faux concern. "That warehouse is sitting on prime commercial land, but the structure itself is a liability. You are paying commercial taxes on an empty shell. As a venture capitalist, it hurts me to see capital tied up like that. You are 70 years old. You should be enjoying your twilight years, not paying taxes on rusted metal." I flipped through the pages slowly, pretending to be overwhelmed by the numbers and the pie charts. He had done his homework. I will give him that. But his math was entirely based on public tax records. He had no idea what was actually going on behind those rusted doors. "I have developers in my network right now," Derek said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that bordered on predatory. "They are looking for industrial footprints in that exact zip code. I can broker a private sale. I can get that dead weight off your hands by the end of the month and put a massive liquid cash injection directly into your retirement account." You would not have to lift a finger. I will handle all the paperwork. I looked over at Brooke. She squeezed his hand, nodding eagerly. Dad, you have to admit he is making total sense, she said softly. You have worked so hard your entire life. You do not need the stress of managing abandoned properties. Derek is a financial genius. He knows exactly how to handle these corporate sales. Let him help you. The rage flared up inside me again, hot and sharp. My sweet, trusting daughter was sitting in my living room, actively helping a parasite try to drain my assets. He had completely brainwashed her. He had convinced her that he was our financial savior, a wealthy expert gracing us with his brilliant business acumen. I wanted to grab him by the collar of his tailored suit and throw him out onto the street. I wanted to demand exactly how much debt he was hiding behind those expensive clothes. Instead, I forced my shoulders to drop. I let out a long, heavy sigh, acting exactly like the tired, confused old man he needed me to be. Well, Derek, I said, tapping my calloused finger against his glossy report. This is an awful lot to take in. I am just not used to moving this fast. My accountant usually handles these tax forms, and I am not too great with all this modern financial jargon. Derek smiled, a look of distinct triumph flashing across his face. You do not have to understand all the jargon, Harrison. That is what I am here for. I can draw up the power of attorney documents this afternoon. Just a limited proxy so I can negotiate with the buyers on your behalf. I shook my head slowly, handing the folder back to him. I appreciate the hard work, son. I really do. But I am old-fashioned. I never sign anything the same day I read it. Leave the proposal with me. Let me read through it this week with a magnifying glass and a cup of tea. We can talk about it again next weekend. Derek's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened. The impatience leaked out just enough for me to catch it. He needed that money fast. The urgency was palpable. Of course, Harrison. He recovered quickly, packing the documents away. Take your time. Just know that real estate markets fluctuate. These buyers will not wait around forever. As I walked them to the door, I noticed Derek pause by the entrance to my private study. His eyes darted past the open door, landing squarely on the heavy vintage steel, safe bolted to the corner of the room. He stared at it for only 2 seconds, but 2 seconds was all I needed to confirm my suspicions. He was not just going to wait for me to sign his papers. He was looking for another way in. The hunt had officially begun, and I was more than ready to play the game. The morning sun crawled across the hardwood floors of my study, illuminating the heavy steel door of my vintage safe. I had been sitting in my leather armchair since dawn, staring at that combination dial, replaying the hungry look in Derek's eyes from the night before. Men like him cannot hide their greed. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The house was completely silent, exactly the way Patty and I used to enjoy our Sunday mornings. I was just about to head out to the garden to clear my head when the sharp chime of the front doorbell shattered the quiet. I glanced at the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was barely 8. Nobody drops by unannounced at this hour unless there is an emergency or they are selling something. I tightened my robe and walked to the foyer. Looking through the peephole, I saw my daughter Brooke and her husband standing on the porch. Derek looked like he had just stepped out of a financial magazine, wearing a crisp, tailored suit, despite it being a Sunday morning. He was clutching a thick leather-bound portfolio tightly against his chest. Brooke looked tired, holding a cardboard tray of coffees, but she wore a strained smile. I unlocked the heavy door and pulled it open, pasting a look of pleasant surprise onto my face. Brooke, sweetheart, what a surprise. I stepped aside to let them in. You should have called. I would have put some breakfast together. We brought pastries, Dad, Brooke said, kissing my cheek as she walked past me into the kitchen. We know it is early, but Derek was up practically all night working on something for you. He was so excited he could not even wait for Monday. I turned to look at Derek. He stood in my foyer, radiating a false energetic warmth. Good morning, Harrison, he said, extending his hand. I am sorry for the ambush, but when an opportunity strikes, you have to grab it. I shook his soft, manicured hand, feeling the stark contrast against my own calloused palms. I led him into the living room, gesturing toward the sofa. Derek sat down, placing his leather portfolio on the coffee table with a heavy thud. He unzipped it with practiced efficiency, pulling out a stack of high-gloss, professionally bound documents. He spread them out across the glass surface. I sat across from him, resting my hands on my knees, playing the part of the confused, aging father perfectly. Harrison. I know we briefly touched on this at dinner last night. Derek began leaning forward to appear earnest and sincere, but I could not stop thinking about your holding properties. I did a deep dive into the county tax records. I hope you do not mind. I just want to look out for the family's future. I picked up the first folder. The cover page showed an aerial map of the industrial district with Warehouse 42 outlined in bright red ink. Next to it was a detailed breakdown of estimated property taxes, maintenance liabilities, and projected losses. You are bleeding money on a dead asset, Harrison, Derek continued, his voice dropping into a tone of deep artificial concern. That warehouse is sitting on prime commercial land, but the structure itself is a massive liability. You are paying high commercial taxes on an empty shell. As a venture capitalist, it physically hurts me to see capital tied up like that. You are 70 years old. You should be enjoying your twilight years, traveling, relaxing, not paying taxes on rusted metal and contaminated soil. I flipped through the pages slowly, pretending to be overwhelmed by the numbers and the colorful pie charts. He had certainly done his homework, but his math was entirely based on public tax records. He had absolutely no idea what was actually going on behind those rusted doors. I have developers in my private network right now, Derek said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that bordered on predatory. They are looking for industrial footprints in that exact zip code. I can broker a private sale. I can get that dead weight off your hands by the end of the month and put a massive liquid cash injection directly into your retirement account. You would not have to lift a single finger. I will handle all the paperwork, the lawyers, the negotiations, everything. Real Brooke walked into the living room, setting down a tray with the coffees and pastries. She sat next to Derek, wrapping her arm around his and looking at me with an expression that made my stomach churn. Dad, you have to admit he is making total sense, Brooke said softly, though there was a distinct edge to her voice. You have worked so hard your entire life. You do not need the stress of managing abandoned properties. You are not a young man anymore. Derek is a financial genius. He knows exactly how to handle these corporate sales. Let him help you. The passive-aggressive sting of her words hit me hard. She was looking at me like I was a relic, an old pack rat clinging to trash. You need to let go of the past, Dad, she continued, her tone patronizing. Those scrapyards, those dirty old warehouses, they belong to a different lifetime. You promised Mom you would take care of yourself. Let Derek handle this. It is what he does best. The rage flared up inside me again, hot and sharp. My sweet, trusting daughter was sitting in my living room, actively helping a parasite try to drain my assets. He had completely brainwashed her. He had convinced her that he was our financial savior, a wealthy expert gracing us with his brilliant business acumen. I wanted to grab him by the collar of his tailored suit and throw him out onto the street. I wanted to demand exactly how much debt he was hiding behind those expensive clothes, but I forced my shoulders to drop. I let out a long, heavy sigh, acting exactly like the tired, confused old man he needed me to be. Well, Derek, this is an awful lot to take in, I said, tapping my finger against his glossy report. I am just not used to moving this fast. My accountant usually handles these tax forms, and I am not too great with all this modern financial jargon. Derek smiled, a look of distinct triumph flashing across his face. You do not have to understand all the jargon, Harrison. That is what I am here for. I can draw up the limited proxy documents this afternoon. Just a signature so I can negotiate with the buyers on your behalf. I shook my head, slowly gathering the folders. I appreciate the hard work, son. I really do. But I never sign anything the same day I read it. Leave the proposal with me. Let me read through it. Derek's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his fake smile plastered on. Of course, Harrison, take your time. Just remember, these buyers will not wait forever. The market is moving fast. I understand. I watched through this front window as Derek guided Brooke down the porch steps. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture that probably looked like loving devotion to anyone else. But to me, it looked exactly like a handler steering his mark. They climbed into his leased sports car, a vehicle I now suspected he could not actually afford, and pulled out of the driveway. The sound of the engine faded down the quiet suburban street, leaving me alone with the heavy, stifling silence of the empty house. I stood there for a long time, feeling a cold, bitter wave of disrespect wash over me. It was not just the arrogance of his financial presentation or the slick, practiced way he tried to manipulate me into signing away a property I had bled for. It was the sheer audacity of coming into my home, eating the pastries my daughter bought, and looking at me as if I were nothing more than a decaying obstacle standing between him and a payday. He looked at me the way a vulture looks at a dying animal. I walked slowly back into the living room and picked up the glossy financial portfolio he had left on the coffee table. I tossed it into the trash can without a second thought. I did not need to read his fabricated numbers. I already knew exactly what he was trying to do. I made my way down this hallway to my private study, the room Derek had been eyeing just moments before. I closed the door behind me and walked over to the vintage steel safe, bolted to the corner of the floor. It was a massive, heavy piece of iron manufactured back in the 1950s. The combination dial was worn smooth from decades of use. I ran my calloused hand over the cold metal feeling, the familiar, reassuring weight of it. This safe was a symbol of everything Patty and I had built. When we started the salvage business, we could not afford a proper banking setup. We kept our first earnings completely in cash, locked inside a small metal lockbox hidden under our bed. As the business grew, so did the risks. I bought this safe after our first major contract, a demolition job that took 6 months to complete. I promised Patty on the day we bolted it to the floor that I would always fill it with enough security to make sure Brooke would never have to struggle the way we did. Patty was a fierce, perceptive woman. She could spot a liar from a mile away. If she were still here, she would have seen right through Derek's expensive suits and hollow charm on the very first day Brooke brought him home for dinner. But Patty was gone, and the responsibility to protect our daughter fell entirely on my shoulders. I looked at the framed photograph of Patty sitting on my desk. Her warm, knowing eyes seemed to pierce right through the glass. "I will not let him break her, Patty," I whispered into the quiet room. "I will not let him take a single dime of what we built," but I knew I had to be smart. If I simply called Brooke and told her that her husband was a scheming gold digger, she would defend him. Derek had spent 2 years building a narrative painting himself as the successful, caring partner. If I attacked him directly, I would become the villain. I would be the paranoid, controlling father trying to ruin her marriage. Derek would use my accusations to drive a wedge between us, isolating Brooke and making her even more dependent on him. I could not allow that to happen. I had to let Derek think he was winning. I had to let him believe his manipulation was working, that the clueless old man was slowly taking the bait. I needed to feed his greed until he became reckless enough to expose his true nature right in front of Brooke. I picked up my phone and dialed Hector Morales. The line rang twice before his gruff voice answered. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," Hector said. "Do we have a problem at the yard today?" "Not at the yard, Hector," I replied, sinking into my leather desk chair. "I need you to do something for me, and I need it done quietly. I want you to pull the original leasing deeds for Warehouse 42. Make high-quality copies of the cover pages, the ones showing my name as the sole proprietor, and the tax assessment values, but redact the leasing agreement with the Federal Transport Company. I do not want any mention of the armored vehicles or the security protocols. Make it look like a standard inactive holding property." Hector was silent for a moment. He was a smart man, a former military logistics officer who never asked unnecessary questions unless he sensed danger. "Are we preparing for a sale, sir?" "No," I said, my voice hardening. "We are preparing a trap. I have a rat sniffing around the perimeter, and I need to lay out some cheese. Put the redacted copies in a standard manila folder and have one of the trusted drivers drop it off at my house this afternoon." "Understood, sir. It will be there by 3 L." I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair, staring at the heavy steel safe. Derek wanted access to my holdings. He wanted to review the deeds. I was going to give him exactly what he asked for, but on my terms. I would invite him over next week under the guise of discussing his proposal. I would hand him the redacted deeds, letting him think he was one step closer to getting my signature. I would play the hesitant but agreeable father-in-law, asking naive questions about venture capital and real estate markets. But I knew Derek, men driven by sudden desperate greed do not have the patience for slow negotiations. His lingering look at my safe told me everything I needed to know. He was evaluating the security of my home. He was wondering what else I kept locked away. If he was willing to manipulate my daughter to steal a warehouse, he was certainly willing to break into my private study to find leverage or cash. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the meticulously manicured lawn. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with families enjoying their peaceful Sunday morning. They had no idea that a quiet war was brewing inside the walls of my home. I needed to prepare the battlefield. I spent the next 2 hours securing the study. I went online and ordered 3 high-definition motion-activated hidden cameras. I chose models designed to look like ordinary objects: a digital clock, a smoke detector, and a charging brick. I paid for expedited shipping, ensuring they would arrive by Tuesday. I planned to position them to cover every angle of the room, with a direct line of sight focusing squarely on the vintage safe. Next, I decided to modify the safe itself. It contained important documents, family heirlooms, and a significant amount of emergency cash. I could not leave those assets vulnerable. I emptied the contents into a heavy duffel bag, intending to move them to a secure bank vault first thing Monday morning. I left only a few stacks of bundled single-dollar bills disguised with $100 bills. On the outside, a classic decoy tactic I learned during my early days in the rough industrial yards. I also left a very specific fabricated document inside. It was a fake inventory sheet printed on official-looking company letterhead. The document detailed a fictional stockpile of unregistered industrial platinum currently being housed at Warehouse 42. It noted the estimated value at $15 million and mentioned an impending quiet liquidation sale. It was the perfect bait designed to appeal directly to a desperate man looking for a massive, untraceable payday. If Derek managed to crack the safe, he would not find my life savings. He would find a one-way ticket to a federal prison sentence. He would find the very thing that would seal his fate. I closed the heavy steel door of the safe, spinning the dial to lock the tumblers in place. The metallic click echoed in the quiet room, a satisfying sound of finality. The board was set. The pieces were moving into position. Derek thought he was the mastermind of this game, the brilliant venture capitalist, outsmarting an outdated relic of the past. He was about to learn that you never step into a scrapyard unless you are fully prepared to get crushed by the machinery. I walked out of the study, locking the door firmly behind me. I went back to the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, and stepped out onto the back patio. The morning air was crisp and cool. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension slowly begin to leave my shoulders. I had made a promise to Patty, and I was going to keep it. I was going to protect our daughter, and I was going to absolutely destroy the man who tried to use her against me. The hunt was on, and I was holding all the keys. I let 2 full weeks pass without giving Derek a single update. I ignored his subtle text messages, dodged his casual phone calls, and maintained the perfect illusion of an old man dragging his feet. I needed him to stew in his own anxiety. I needed the pressure on his end to build until it cracked his polished exterior. That crack finally appeared on a crisp Tuesday morning, right in front of my daughter's flower shop. Brooke owned a beautiful little boutique in the historic district. She had poured her heart, her soul, and every ounce of her savings into that place. It always smelled of fresh eucalyptus, damp potting soil, and blooming lies. I decided to drop by unannounced, bringing her favorite cinnamon scones from the bakery down the street. I parked my truck a block away and walked toward her storefront, enjoying the brisk morning air. But as I rounded the corner, the picturesque scene of her charming boutique was shattered by the harsh, grinding sound of heavy diesel machinery. A massive battered tow truck was backed aggressively into the loading zone right behind Brooke's shop. The hydraulic lift was already engaged, whining loudly as it hoisted the front tires of Brooke's custom-painted floral delivery van off the pavement. I quickened my pace, my heart giving a hard thump. Through the large glass windows of the boutique, I saw Brooke. She was standing on the sidewalk, wrapping her cardigan tightly around herself, her shoulders shaking. She was crying. A burly man in a high-visibility vest was standing next to the tow truck, holding a clipboard and looking completely unimpressed by her tears. I rushed forward, dropping the bakery box onto a nearby wrought iron bench. "Brew, sweetheart, what is going on here?" I asked, wrapping a protective arm around her trembling shoulders. She looked up at me, her mascara slightly smudged beneath her eyes. "Dad, I do not understand," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "He says he is repossessing the van. He says we have missed 3 consecutive lease payments, but that is impossible. Derek handles all the business accounts. He set up the auto pay for the commercial vehicles months ago. There has to be some kind of terrible mistake." I turned my gaze to the man with the clipboard. He had the tired, cynical look of a guy who dealt with people's worst days for a living. I approached him, keeping my tone level but firm. "Excuse me, friend, I think there might be a clerical error here. My daughter owns this business. We can clear this up right now." The repo man did not even blink. "Look, buddy, I just get the work orders," he said, tapping his pen against the metal clip. "The leasing company issued the recovery order yesterday afternoon. 3 months delinquent. No response to the warning letters. The grace period is over. I am just here to collect the asset. You want to argue the numbers? Call the bank." I reached into my breast pocket for my checkbook. I was fully prepared to write a check right there on the hood of his truck to stop my daughter from crying. But before my hand even unbuttoned my coat, the screech of tires echoed down the street. Derek's leased sports car swerved into the loading zone, mounting the curb aggressively before slamming to a halt. He threw his door open and sprinted toward us. He did not look like the confident, arrogant venture capitalist who had sat in my living room 2 weeks ago. He looked like a man running for his life. His normally immaculate hair was disheveled, plastered to his forehead with a sheen of cold sweat. His tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned, and his eyes were wild with a frantic, desperate energy. "Hey, stop right there. Drop that vehicle immediately," Derek shouted, waving his arms as he marched up to the repo man. "What the hell do you think you are doing? This is a massive banking error. You are stealing private property." The tow truck driver crossed his arms over his chest. "Save the performance, pal. The account is empty. The payments bounced. I am hooking the rear axle and pulling out of here in 2 minutes." Derek pulled a sleek smartphone from his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it onto the concrete. He was dialing numbers with frantic, jerky motions. "Listen to me very closely," he growled, pacing back and forth in a tight, agitated circle. "My wealth management firm handles millions of dollars in liquid assets. My private bank flagged the autodraft as a fraudulent transactions because of a security update. It is a protective hold on the commercial account. That is all. I am transferring the funds from my personal portfolio right now." He shoved the phone against his ear, his jaw clamped so tight the muscles twitched. I watched him closely, letting my protective father persona mask the cold, calculating observation happening behind my eyes. I watched the heavy bead of sweat trace down the side of his neck. I watched the erratic, trembling rhythm of his hands. I saw the way his expensive leather shoes shifted restlessly against the pavement. Brooke stepped forward, reaching out to touch his arm. Derek, what is happening? Why would the bank freeze the account for 3 months without telling us? Derek flinched away from her touch just for a fraction of a second, but I caught it. It was the physical reaction of a cornered animal. Do not worry about it, Brooke. He snapped, his voice much sharper than the gentle tone he usually reserved for her. I told you it is a technical glitch. The wire transfers got crossed between the offshore holding and the domestic branch. I am fixing it. Just let me work. He spent the next 10 minutes arguing furiously with someone on the phone. He paced down the alleyway, his voice hushed but frantic, making wild, pleading gestures with his free hand. Finally, he marched back to the repo man, shoving the phone into the driver's face. The driver listened for a moment, let out a loud, heavy sigh, and handed the phone back. Fine, he muttered, looking at Derek with absolute disgust. The agency just confirmed a manual wire transfer. You bought yourself 30 days, buddy. But if that wire bounces back, I am coming straight to your driveway next time. With a loud hiss of releasing pressure, the hydraulic lift lowered Brooke's delivery van back onto the pavement. The tow truck detached its heavy steel hooks and rattled away down the street, leaving a thick cloud of diesel exhaust in its wake. Brooke let out a massive breath, leaning against the side of her van. Oh my God, she whispered, rubbing her temples. That was terrifying. Derek, are you sure everything is okay with the business account? Derek forced a laugh, running a trembling hand through his ruined hair. He pulled Brooke into a tight hug, kissing the top of her head. Everything is perfectly fine, babe, I promise. Just a stupid clerical error at the bank. You know how these massive institutions operate. The algorithms flag a large transfer, and suddenly everything freezes. I will have my assistant yell at our account manager this afternoon. Brooke smiled, leaning into his chest, entirely comforted by his words. But as Derek looked over her shoulder, his eyes met mine. For one brief, unguarded second, the mask slipped completely. I did not see a wealthy investor looking back at me. I saw pure, unadulterated terror. He quickly plastered his fake, arrogant smile back onto his face and clapped his hands together. Well, crisis averted, he declared, his voice pitching an octave too high. Harrison, good to see you. Sorry for the morning drama. Just the trials and tribulations of high-level corporate banking night. Right, I replied smoothly, picking up the bakery box from the bench and handing it to Brooke. High-level corporate banking. I hugged my daughter, kissed her cheek, and told her I would call her later. I walked back to my truck, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I did not start the engine immediately. I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. Millionaire venture capitalists do not get their wives' delivery vans repossessed over a technical glitch. Men who manage vast portfolios of liquid assets do not shake uncontrollably while trying to wire a few hundred to a collections agency. They do not pace like desperate addicts in a back alley. They do not look at a tow truck driver with absolute pants wetting terror as if their life is on the line. Derek Thorne was not experiencing a banking error. He was drowning. He was suffocating under a mountain of debt, scrambling to plug holes in a sinking ship. He had drained Brooke's commercial accounts dry, leaving her completely exposed, completely vulnerable, and totally unaware of the financial ruin creeping up on her. My gut feeling had evolved from a simple suspicion into a hard, undeniable fact. My son-in-law was a desperate, dangerous fraud, and he was currently bleeding my daughter's business to death to keep himself afloat. He needed a massive infusion of cash to save his own skin, which explained exactly why he was suddenly so interested in liquidating my industrial warehouse. He was hunting for a lifeline, and I was going to hand him an anvil. That Friday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Brooke on my porch with an overnight bag, looking exhausted. Derek stood behind her, gripping a duffel, wearing a strained smile. They claimed a plumbing issue flooded their master bathroom and ruined the carpets in their townhouse. The property management company, Derek explained, needed the weekend to run industrial dehumidifiers. It sounded like a reasonable inconvenience, but I knew better. Millionaires do not pack their bags and flee to their father-in-law's guest room over a burst pipe. They check into a hotel downtown and let their insurance foot the bill. I smiled warmly, stepping aside, offering them the guest suite. I knew exactly why they were here. The plumbing issue was a fabricated excuse. Derek was running out of time. His creditors were circling. The repossession agency was breathing down his neck, and he needed unfettered access to my home. Having him sleep under my roof felt like inviting a venomous snake into my bed, but I played the gracious host. I cooked dinner, poured him a glass of scotch, and listened to him boast about phantom investment portfolios. Brooke leaned against his shoulder, blind to the frantic desperation radiating from him. By 10, they excused themselves to bed. I waited until I heard the heavy oak door of the guest suite click shut. Then I retreated to my bedroom, leaving the door open just to crack. I did not sleep. I lay on top of my covers in the dark, fully clothed, listening to the ambient sounds of the house I had lived in for 3 decades. When you spend your life guarding scrapyards filled with valuable copper, you become a very light sleeper. You learn to differentiate between the harmless settling of a foundation and the deliberate footfalls of a trespasser. The house was silent for hours. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed midnight, then 1 cly. The neighborhood was dead to the world, and then at exactly 14 minutes past 2 in the morning, I heard it. It was a subtle, muffled groan of wood. The 4th floorboard in the upstairs hallway, right outside the guest suite, has a distinct squeak if you step squarely on its center. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress and stood up my bare feet, silent against the carpet. I did not turn on any lights. I moved through the shadows of my home with the practiced ease of a man who knows every angle of his territory. I crept down the stairs, my breathing slow and measured. The downstairs hallway was bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight filtering through the high windows. I stopped at the bottom of the staircase, pressing my back against the cool plaster of the wall. Someone was moving around in my private study. The heavy mahogany door to the study was pushed open just a fraction of an inch. A thin beam of pale light sliced through the narrow gap, dancing across the hallway floor. I edged closer, leaning my head forward to peer through the crack. Derek was inside. He was dressed in dark sweatpants and a black t-shirt, holding a small pen light between his teeth. He was kneeling in front of my heavy fireproof filing cabinet, the one positioned directly beneath the framed photograph of Patty. He had bypassed the vintage steel safe in the corner. He must have realized during his first visit that he lacked the tools to crack a mechanical combination lock. He was focusing on the filing cabinet, utilizing a thin metal tension wrench and a lockpick to manipulate the simple cylinder lock, holding the drawers shut. I watched him work. His breathing was heavy, ragged, echoing in the quiet room. His hands were shaking with a terrifying, unhinged urgency. He was not a professional thief. He was a desperate man backed into a corner, completely devoid of morals or boundaries. The lock gave way with a soft metallic click. Derek practically ripped the bottom drawer open. He began tearing through the hanging folders, tossing aside utility bills, property deeds, and old tax returns. He was hunting for something specific. He wanted liquid numbers. He wanted to know exactly what I was worth and how quickly he could get his hands on it to pay off the monsters breathing down his neck. I let him search for another full minute, absorbing the sheer audacity of his betrayal. He was standing in the house my sweat had paid for, trying to steal the future I had secured for the woman sleeping upstairs. I stepped into the doorway, raised my hand, and firmly flicked the brass light switch on the wall. The study was instantly flooded with harsh, bright yellow light. Derek gasped a sharp, terrified sound and physically recoiled. He dropped the pen light onto the carpet and spun around, his eyes wide, his chest heaving. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. "Derek," I said, keeping my voice mild, almost groggy, as if I had just woken up from a deep slumber. "What on earth are you doing down here in the dark? Is everything all right with the guest room?" For 3 agonizing seconds, he stared at me, his mind clearly scrambling to process the situation and invent a plausible lie. Then the slick, manipulative con artist took over. He let out a breathless, forced chuckle and ran a hand through his hair, leaning casually against the filing cabinet to block my view of the open drawer behind his legs. Harrison, he exhaled, placing a hand over his heart in a gesture of exaggerated relief. You scared the living daylights out of me. I am so sorry for sneaking around. I woke up with terrible heartburn. That spicy brisket we had for dinner really did a number on my stomach. I did not want to wake Brooke, so I came downstairs looking for the kitchen. I must have gotten turned around in the dark and wandered into your office. I was just trying to find a light switch. I smiled, a gentle, accommodating smile that masked the absolute disgust boiling in my veins. Of course, son, I said, my tone dripping with fake sympathy. The kitchen is down the hall to the left. I keep a bottle of antacids in the pantry above the sink. Let me go grab them for you. I turned and walked to the kitchen, leaving him alone for just a few seconds. When I returned and handed him the chalky tablets, he thanked me profusely, wishing me a good night before hurrying back upstairs. I waited until his footsteps faded completely. Then I walked back into my study. He had closed the cabinet drawer, but in his blind panic, he made a careless mistake. I pulled the drawer open and looked inside. The folder detailing my total net worth and liquid cash reserves was pulled halfway up, sticking out awkwardly from the rest of the meticulously organized files. He had found exactly what he was looking for right there in the quiet house. The next morning, I stood in the kitchen, casually flipping through the newspaper. Brooke came downstairs first, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and kissed my cheek. Derek followed shortly after, looking surprisingly refreshed for a man who had spent the early hours of the morning picking the lock on a filing cabinet. He greeted me with hollow enthusiasm, pouring cereal and chatting about the weather. I played the gracious host, offering a warm smile and asking if his heartburn had settled down. He assured me it had, completely oblivious to what I actually knew. The hidden cameras had been discreetly installed, while Brooke and Derek were running errands the previous afternoon. One was tucked inside a digital clock on the living room mantel, offering a sweeping view of the seating area. I knew how to rig a trap to catch a rat. Derek had taken the bait in the study, but a slightly displaced file folder was not enough to condemn him. If I brought it up to Brooke, he would simply spin a dozen believable lies. I needed irrefutable proof. I needed him caught in the act, captured on high-definition video, completely violating my trust. After breakfast, Brooke mentioned she needed a shower before a meeting. Derek said he was going to read in the living room. It was the perfect opportunity. I casually told them I was going for a walk. As I passed through the living room, I pulled my iPad from my briefcase. I unlocked the screen, leaving the auto lock disabled. I opened my email and pulled up a carefully fabricated message I had created the night prior. It looked like confidential correspondence from my wealth management bank. The subject read, "Urgent portfolio liquidation." The body detailed a fictional impending transfer of $7 million into a highly liquid checking account. It was the ultimate prize for a drowning man. I placed the unlocked iPad gently onto the center of the coffee table right next to Derek. I grabbed my walking stick, called out a cheerful goodbye to the empty hallway, and walked out the front door, pulling it shut with a loud, definitive click. I did not go for a walk. I walked 2 blocks down the street and slid into my truck. I pulled out my smartphone and immediately opened the secure application linked to my hidden cameras. The live feed buffered before snapping into crystal clear, high-definition focus. I stared at the small screen, my breathing slow and steady, watching the silent movie play out inside my living room. For the first 2 minutes, Derek did nothing. He sat on the sofa holding a magazine, staring blankly. He was listening. He was waiting to ensure Brooke was upstairs, and I was genuinely gone. The faint sound of the running shower provided the all-clear signal. He lowered the magazine. His head snapped toward the coffee table, his eyes locking onto the glowing screen of my iPad. He stared at it as if it were a pile of gold bullion. The internal debate lasted only a matter of seconds. The sheer intoxicating lure of the fabricated email was simply too strong for him to resist. He leaned forward, casting a quick, paranoid glance over his shoulder toward the staircase. Seeing nothing but empty space, he reached out and snatched the iPad right off the glass table. The camera feed captured his face with agonizing clarity. The polished mask of the successful venture capitalist vanished, replaced by the feral, hungry expression of a scavenger. His eyes darted across the screen, reading the fake email. I watched his jaw drop slightly. He practically vibrated with adrenaline. $7 million in liquid cash ready to be transferred. It was the exact lifeline he had been desperately hunting for. Derek did not just read the email. He immediately pulled his own sleek smartphone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently, he had to rest his elbows on his knees to steady the camera lens. He began snapping pictures of the iPad screen, capturing the fake account numbers, the routing details, and the contact information for the fictional bank manager. The dam had broken, and his greed was in complete control. I watched in cold disgust as he closed the email application and began frantically swiping through my private device. He opened my digital banking apps, my investment portfolios, and my personal text messages. He was searching for passwords, security questions, anything he could use to drain my assets dry. He photographed every single screen. He was moving with a terrifying unhinged speed, his thumbs flying across the glass. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was not a banking error, and it was certainly not a concerned son-in-law trying to protect his family. The plausible lie was utterly dead. I was watching a calculated, predatory invasion of privacy. I was watching a thief meticulously planning the destruction of my life's work. My hands tightened around the steering wheel until the leather creaked. I felt a deep sorrow for Brooke. She was upstairs washing her hair, completely oblivious to the fact that the man she loved was actively trying to rob her father blind. Derek thought he had hit the ultimate jackpot. He thought he had stumbled upon the key to solving his massive financial failures. He had no idea that every frantic swipe was being recorded and stored on a secure cloud server, building an impenetrable wall of evidence against him. After 5 minutes of frantic digital pillaging, the sound of the upstairs shower must have shut off. Derek froze. His head snapped up. He hastily closed all the applications on the iPad, returning it to the exact screen and position where I had left it. He dropped his phone back into his pocket, picked up his magazine, and leaned back against the sofa cushions, crossing his legs in a picture of relaxed leisure. He wiped a bead of nervous sweat from his brow, his eyes darting one last time toward the stairs, just to be absolutely certain he was safe. He took a deep breath, smoothing his hair and adjusting his collar instantly, transforming back into the perfect, supportive husband. I closed the application on my phone, plunging the screen into darkness. The silence inside my truck was absolute. I sat there for a few moments, letting the cold reality settle deep into my bones. The hunt was over. The trap had sprung and the rat was caught. I would not let him take away the life that Patty and I had built. This was my domain, and he had made a fatal miscalculation today. I now possessed the exact leverage I needed to completely destroy Derek Thorne and sever his parasitic hold on my daughter. I took a deep, steady breath, pushed open the heavy door, and began the short walk back to my house. The deception was finished, and the time for patience had passed. I was ready to tear down his illusion and show Brooke the truth. The morning after, I watched my son-in-law try to steal my digital identity. I told Brooke and Derek I was going to the store. Instead, I drove my truck to a faded diner. I slid into a corner booth. 10 minutes later, Thomas pulled into the parking lot. He was a private investigator I had retained decades ago. He was a quiet man who possessed a talent for finding the dirt people buried deep underground. He slid into the booth across from me, placing a thick manila folder on the scratched Formica table. He did not bother with pleasantries. He just ordered a black coffee and looked at me with grim, tired eyes. "You were right to trust your gut on this one, Harrison. Thomas said. I dug into Derek Thorne and his wealth management firm. The entire operation is a facade constructed of smoke and mirrors. I kept my hands resting flat on the table. Tell me exactly what we are dealing with. Thomas opened the folder. He slid a grainy photograph of a strip mall across the table. Thorne Venture Capital does not exist. It is a rented post office box inside a shipping center. There is no corporate office. There is no board of directors. There is no massive portfolio of liquid assets. He is registered as a sole proprietor, but he has not filed a legitimate corporate tax return in over 3 years. I felt my jaw tighten. How is he affording the tailored suits and the leased sports cars? How did he manage to fool Brooke? Thomas slid another piece of paper toward me. 2 years ago, Derek actually had some money. He received a decent inheritance from his late grandfather. He poured every single penny of it into a massive cryptocurrency scheme. He thought he was going to become a billionaire overnight. Instead, the platform collapsed. He lost his entire inheritance in the span of 48 hours. My stomach twisted into a heavy knot. He lost everything. Worse than everything. Thomas corrected, leaning forward. When he lost his inheritance, he tried to chase his losses. He started borrowing money to buy back into the market, hoping for a miraculous rebound. When the legitimate banks cut him off, he went to the shadow lenders. He currently owes just over $2 million to a very dangerous loan shark syndicate operating out of Chicago. I stared at the red numbers. The puzzle pieces slammed into place with sickening clarity. The desperate pacing in the alleyway. The sheer terror in his eyes when the tow truck driver threatened to return. The frantic attempt to break into my filing cabinet, and the joy on his face when he saw the fake email detailing a $7 million transfer. Derek was a dead man walking. The people he owed money to did not send angry letters. They sent men to break legs and burn down houses. There is more, Harrison, Thomas said softly, and this is the part that is going to make you want to kill him. Thomas pulled a final stack of papers from the folder. They were detailed transaction logs. I recognized the account name immediately. It was the commercial business account for Brooke's Floral Boutique. I pulled the financial records for your daughter's shop. Thomas explained, his tone heavy with sympathy. When they got married, Derek convinced Brooke to let him handle the accounting. He told her it would take the stress off her shoulders, but he has not been managing her accounts. He has been systematically draining them. I picked up the papers, my hands trembling slightly. Every week for the past 8 months, Derek had been siphoning thousands of dollars out of Brooke's business account. He was routing the money through a maze of shell companies, desperately trying to scrape together enough cash to make the minimum monthly interest payments on his $2 million syndicate debt. He stopped paying her commercial leases 3 months ago. Thomas continued, that is why her delivery van was repossessed yesterday. He stopped paying her wholesale flower suppliers. He stopped paying the boutique's utility bills. Her business is completely insolvent. Harrison, she is operating on fumes. By the end of this month, the bank will freeze her accounts and she will be forced into bankruptcy. The air in my lungs turned to ash. Brooke had built that boutique from nothing. She had spent countless nights awake at her kitchen table sketching floral arrangements and building a clientele. It was her dream, her pride and joy, and her husband was bleeding it dry behind her back to save his own miserable life. He was destroying her. He is using her as a human shield. I whispered, my voice sounding rough. He is drowning Harrison, Thomas said, pushing the folder toward me. And when a man like Derek starts to drown, he will pull down whoever is closest to him just to get another breath of air. He targeted you because you are his last resort. He saw your properties, and he thought he could manipulate you into signing over an asset. He needs a massive payout right now. If he does not get it, those loan sharks will come. I reached out and placed my hand over the manila folder. I felt a sudden, profound calm wash over me. It was the same cold, calculating focus I used to feel when I was standing in the scrapyard, preparing to dismantle a massive, dangerous piece of machinery. There was no room for error. There was no room for hesitation. Every move had to be precise, deliberate, and devastating. Derek had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had manipulated my daughter's heart. He had stolen her hard-earned money. He had brought the shadow of violent, dangerous criminals right to our doorstep. He had looked me in the eye and smiled while he actively planned the destruction of my family. "Thank you, Thomas," I said, sliding the folder into my briefcase. "You did exceptional work. What are you going to do, Harrison?" Thomas asked, watching me closely. "If you need me to contact the authorities, I have friends in the Financial Crimes Division. We can have him arrested for fraud before the end of the week." I shook my head slowly, finishing my coffee. "No, the authorities would just put him in a cell. That is too easy. That is an escape. If he goes to prison now, Brooke will think it is a mistake. She will think he was just a businessman who got in over his head.